Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Another flagrant example of our counter-programming here, although we are going to talk about politics, just politics from a very long time ago. We have Lindsay Chervinsky, whose new book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic, is out. I have lots and lots of friends who love this book. Lindsay is a presidential historian and the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library, which I hear Washington raised an enormous amount of money to put up. She's the author of the award-winning books, The Cabinet, George Washington, and the Creation of an American Institution, and Making the Presidency, this book that we're going to be talking about now, and all sorts of other stuff, because she's one of those people, one of those overachievers. Lindsay Chervinsky, Professor Chervinsky, welcome to the Remnant.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, as tradition holds, first question for you is, what's your book about?
The book is about two things. The first thing is, what does it take for the presidency to survive after Washington? And that was a major question at the time because he was of such unparalleled status and stature that his decisions were, compared to any other president, largely unchecked, or there was a lack of pushback. And so there were real questions about whether or not the powers, and they were considered enormous powers at the time, could be entrusted to anyone else, whether the office would work with anyone else, and whether the precedents he established would continue. And so John Adams, knowing that whoever came next was going to have a terrible time because they were going to fail spectacularly to live up to those sort of lofty expectations and ideals of Washington, came in determined to try and preserve this office as Washington had envisioned it. The second piece is, what does it take to create the peaceful transfer of power? Because in the 1790s, if they looked around the world, it was not done anywhere. And the transitions they were most used to were the French Revolution, which is the opposite of what you want to emulate. And so they had to teach the American people how to actually do this thing and how to participate in it and lay the norms and precedents and customs that would eventually serve as the scaffolding of our political institutions.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like, this is a persistent problem well into the 21st century, right? I mean, there's a reason it's a cliche to talk about one man, one vote, one time, and a lot of countries testing out democracy is you get elected president, then you're like, okay, let's pull up the ladder behind us and stay in here for a while. And it would have made even more sense 250 years ago, given that there was, you had to go back to, I don't know, the Republic of Venice or ancient Greece to kind of find any kind of precedence for it. So, so before we get to John Adams and his institution building and all of this, can you just clarify for me what the hell the founders were thinking with having the guy who came in second in an election become vice president? Like, how do they think that was supposed to work? And what did they expect the vice president to do? For people who don't know, John Adams was Washington's vice president. And so, like, what did they think the vice presidency was really for?
So there were elements of the Constitution that were incredibly well thought out and debated and contested and edited and refined. The vice presidency is not one of them. The vice presidency is sort of an afterthought, actually, much like the Electoral College. The Electoral College was created by a committee kind of at the last minute. And I often refer to the vice presidency as the hamate bone of the Constitution. So for baseball fans, they know that there's this bone in your hand that is totally useless. And often if you get hit in the hand with a baseball, it breaks and you're out for a long time. And so a number of managers have suggested when you're a baby, you should just have the bone removed so you can, get rid of this challenge. The vice president, I mean, it has two obligations. It's to cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate and to have a pulse. And your question gets at the challenge of the institution, or the office, which is that it's very weird and it's very hard because it doesn't really have a job unless the president gives that person one. But why would they give their number two and their potential runner, like sort of successor, responsibilities to potentially overshadow them? And so the tension between the loyalty required of that office to have a successful future in politics and the 1 and 2 dynamic is weird. And we see this dynamic play out over history. If you look at the British royalty, there's hundreds of years where father and son don't get along because it's clear that you have a successor there, and it doesn't work. And I think in a lot of ways, by creating the vice presidency, they put the same dynamic into the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really have a good answer about what they were thinking, because it was kind of a last minute thing. It was a recognition that you might need someone in place. You need a way to, cast tie-breaking votes. And it clearly has played out to be a very weird office, at times highly irrelevant. There's whole swaths of American history where we didn't have one because they were so irrelevant that no one really bothered to figure out how to replace them. And today, it often causes enormous political problems.
When you say we didn't have one, you mean like a vice president died or something, and then
they would die, and then for a long time there wasn't really a constitutional mechanism to replace them. And so if you look, I highly encourage everyone to look at Wikipedia and look at the list of vice presidents, and you'll see there are whole gaps where there just wasn't one.
So again, we're going to get to John Adams, I promise. But you've written a lot about George Washington. How did George Washington see the role of the vice president, right? I mean, Washington sets up gets the ball rolling with all these norms and stuff. What did he ask John Adams to do?
Nothing. So this is, and this is where I think actually there's a possibility, there's a road not traveled where the vice president could have been something. And that's because so much of our system isn't actually written down. The Constitution, when it was first drafted, was only 4,000 words, or just over 4,000 words, which was the shortest constitution in the world and would have remained so today. It's now at about 7,700 with the amendments. That's the second shortest constitution, just after Japan. So there's a whole lot that is not actually declared in the Constitution, which left Washington enormous leeway to build out all of the, what I call the fuzzy bits of the presidency and the Constitution, the interactions, how you actually use power, when you don't use power, how do you dress, how are presidents transported? I mean, all the things that kind of go into the day-to-day existence. And the vice presidency was one of them. So he could have leaned on John Adams almost as like a prime minister in Congress, and as someone who was there to really represent the administration and their agenda, to curry favor and support. And he didn't. And I think he didn't for a couple of reasons. One, John Adams, very early on in Washington's presidency, advocated for a more ostentatious title for the president. He had spent the previous decade in Europe. He had been at Versailles in the court of St. James, and he worried that when European diplomats came to Philadelphia, they would think, or first New York and then Philadelphia, what is this podunk, backwater, nothing nation? And he thought that a more sort of regal title would instill both foreign and domestic respect for this office. And so he suggested something like His Elected Majesty and Protector of Our Liberties. Doesn't really roll off the tongue.
No, not very American.
No. But there were a lot of debates at the time about what is American, because the nation was only, at this point, they had declared independence in 76 and had won it in 83. And this was 89. So there were still a lot of questions about what does it mean to be a new nation that's not Britain and not France. So in response, a lot of his opponents called him things like the dangerous vice or his rotundity. And it basically killed his political cachet for Washington's administration. And so at that point, Washington really distanced himself. And I think that closed off any further collaboration, because Washington didn't really trust his political judgment and never invited Adams to a single cabinet meeting. They socialized all the time because it was a very small social circle, and Adams was expected to attend all of Washington's sort of official, what we would consider to be official White House events. He was often at the president's house multiple times per week, but they only had one in-depth conversation, and it was in the spring of 1796. And Adams made note of it because it was so unusual.
Okay, so Adams, pretty much what everybody's like, if you only remember your 10th grade AP history, it was Alien and Sedition Acts, right? part of your argument is that not everything he did was great, but some of the things he did were great in terms of setting up how the president works. So, what's the nitty gritty on that? Like, how did he kind of create the actual office of the presidency and make and reinforce the idea of the transition of power?
Yeah. So we should circle back to the Alien and Sedition Acts, because I do think they are the low point of his presidential service, but not in necessarily the way people think. But he did, as you said, a lot of really good things. And the first was showing up. Almost no one wanted to be the second president, because who would want to follow Washington? And he knew that, and he did it anyway. And it took remarkable political courage. And I think that is something that really can't be overstated. The second piece was there were a lot of attempts by the extreme members of his own party, which I call the arch Federalists. These are people like Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, Secretary of Treasury Oliver Wolcott Jr., that were trying to undermine the presidency, were trying to seize power for themselves, were trying to make this new American army that had been raised in response to threats from France basically a spoils system for the Federalist Party, and not like the U.S. Army today, where we sort of expect presidents to be very supportive of our armed forces, and rightfully so. This was a very dangerous army that Alexander Hamilton wanted to use for highly partisan purposes, including marching south through Virginia to crush his political opposition and down to South America to stir up rebellions for good measure.
That's not in the musical.
Yeah, indeed, it is not. Yeah, I mean, the thing about Alexander Hamilton is, tangent here. He was totally brilliant. He was also totally nuts. And, Adams had the good sense to say, this guy is a little nuts, and I'm not sure we should entrust an army to him. And that craziness, while Washington was president, well, first of all, Washington was commander in chief, and then while he was president, that craziness was kept in check because Hamilton was so deferential to Washington. He was not deferential to Adams, and they had massive conflicts, especially over foreign policy, which infuriated Adams, because he was basically thinking, here is this, bastard nobody, which he called him that, who has, other than being born in the Caribbean, has never left the United States, has never had a diplomatic position, has never been to Europe, has no idea how any of these courts work. And he's lecturing me, Adams, who has done all of those things. So it was a very bad personal relationship. But so Adams basically takes all of those threats and manages, sometimes messily, to neutralize them. And he retains executive power over foreign policy and the administration's agenda, which is what we expect today. He establishes the idea that a president can fire a cabinet secretary, which had actually been a constitutional question, because Washington had fired other people, but he had never fired a cabinet secretary, because when he was displeased with someone, they were so horrified, they just quit. That's right. Kind of the power of Washington's approval. And when Congress created the department secretaries in the summer of 1789, they didn't specify how they were to be removed because they couldn't come to an agreement. So they just punted on it and didn't put it in the bill. And so Adams was the first to do so. And when the Senate affirmed his replacement, John Marshall, as the next Secretary of State, it established a precedent that the Supreme Court actually upheld in the 1920s. So over the course of his presidency, Adams defended the executive branch from both internal and external threats from his party and from other political forces. He resisted the temptation to give in to partisan impulses and instead put the nation's best interests above his own political fortunes. And this is particularly true with the decision to pursue diplomatic peace with France, which he did towards the end of his presidency, and understood that in doing so, he was going to fracture his party and probably guarantee his loss in the upcoming election, and did it anyway because it was the right thing to do for the nation. And then, of course, there's the peaceful transfer of power part. And that's, I think, the transition in 1797 is often overshadowed by what comes 4 years later, but is so essential to starting this process. And then the election of 1800 and the transition in 1801, we forget, because we often think about Jefferson's words about the revolution of 1800 and how this, miraculous this was. there were mobs outside the Capitol threatening to kill anyone who took the presidency from Jefferson. And
Mm-hmm.
the militias from Virginia and Pennsylvania were on the state border ready to march into DC. So the possibility of violence and the Constitution failing and falling apart was so unbelievably close that Adams' decision to show restraint and to ensure that the transition went smoothly and peacefully is just essential to the future of the Republic.
Yeah, because that's the other, right? So, like, the first one is transfer of power from one leader to another, but the other one is transfer of power to an opposing party, which is also
and to a
one of the
person you
things.
despise.
Right.
To a person who's been criticizing you for years and who has come remarkably close to treason. And yet to do it anyway in a way that is incredibly gracious is hard. No one wants to do that, really.
So we just did it, because here at the Remnant, we stop at nothing to pander to the basest interests of the mass public. We recently did a whole episode on Martin Van Buren, and
I didn't think the sentence was going in that direction.
Martin Van Buren is famous for basically being the architect of the party system as we know it today. But one of the points is that there were parties, but there was more in like a Burkean sense, right? There were factions with names, but they weren't organized parties. Mm-hmm. Can you sort of explore that about like what did party mean to Adams and I guess to Washington, and did it change his understanding of what democracy was, right? Anyway, you get the point.
Yeah. Well, so a misconception is that like the founders were opposed to parties, and even Madison wasn't opposed to parties, even though when he was writing about sort of the danger of them, they just expected them to look quite different. They did expect there to be lots of different factions that would shift and morph depending on an issue and form new coalitions depending on what was happening at the moment. And that was sort of based on what we would consider to be like a parliamentary method, where you have lots of parties that maybe form a ruling coalition for any given moment. When the parties did calcify into two camps, you're right that they were not the sophisticated organization of Martin Van Buren, but the Democratic Republican Party, which they called the Republican Party, which of course should not be confused with the Republican Party of Lincoln or Reagan or today, was actually more sophisticated than people think. They had a very widespread newspaper network, and newspapers were of course the main form of information acquisition. They supported editors that were on their side. They had communication committees that would share information from state to state and from district to district. And in Virginia, which was a critical state, they had a massive, basically voter turnout mechanism in place designed to ensure that the state elections went their way, and thus the electoral votes went their way because the state legislatures selected the electors. Including, there was a rule at the time that the ballot had to be handwritten, but the writing on the ballot and the signature did not need to match. So they hand wrote out about 30,000 ballots that had the people they wanted so that voters could just sign and put them in and wouldn't have to remember the slate of electors. So that's actually fairly sophisticated campaign work at a time when you don't have telephones and you don't have internet to actually organize that kind of effort. Adams and Washington in particular resented the idea that they were supposed to be party men. They certainly ideologically affiliated more with the Federalist Party. They believed that a strong government and a standing army was essential. They both believed in the importance of a navy. They had been big advocates for a navy. They believed that the government should invest in infrastructure and education projects, that Great Britain needed to be an ally because they were the largest trade partner, and that France, while it was still in the throes of the French Republic, was an untrustworthy ally. They also were opposed to a lot of the ideas of the Democratic Republican Party, but they never thought that they should rule for their party. They thought that as president, they were supposed to be president for all Americans. They were supposed to be above party, which I think is some of the best instincts of what it means to be president. And I think our best presidents have tried to govern in that way. It's just that our party system has sort of rejected that concept because the way that the two parties have split out, we now have a president who has to be the head of state, the head of the executive branch and the head of party all at once. And those are often in conflict with one another.
Um, so this idea of multiple parties in a sort of a parliamentary thing along the parliamentary model, I understand where that assumption would come from, because that was the experience of anybody who had any experience in Europe with anything like a parliamentary system. But
Mm-hmm.
the way the Constitution is written and the way the state constitutions are written,
Mm-hmm.
the system is inclined just towards it doesn't lay out that there should just be two parties, but that's
Yeah.
the essence of it, because all you if it's winner take all, it doesn't say first past the post or anything like that, but it
Mm-hmm.
does. It basically means that like if you win a plurality, you
Mm-hmm.
win. Therefore, the game theory of it is the
Mm-hmm.
more parties you have, the more you're diluting the coalition that you want to be part of and helping the coalition that you're not part of. So why this anticipation that there would be multiple factions when, in fact, for most of American history, it was sort of obvious that you couldn't have more than two parties for very long?
Yeah. So I think that they were largely looking based on history, which is that you didn't typically have a republic with two parties as large as ours. It was very
Mm-hmm.
difficult to govern and control, and it was unwieldy. And that makes sense in terms of the nation was already quite large. It was much larger in terms of its footprint than, say, Venice, or even the city of Rome. And so I think they were looking at history and they're thinking, as the nation expands, it's going to be impossible to have a party that could be organized on a grand scale,
Right.
which makes sense. Also, a lot of the institutional pieces today that limit the idea of a third party's efficacy were not in place. So, a lot of the limitations today are the way the primary system works at the state level. It's almost impossible to get people on the ballot to have any real chance. None of that was in place at the time because you didn't have a primary system like this one. And of course, you had a Senate that worked in a very different fashion because it was appointed. The senators were appointed by the state legislatures, which, in theory, you could have state legislatures that were forming coalitions to kind of have these compromise candidates. So I think it's not a totally insane idea. It's just that the way the Electoral College votes are counted right now, and the way that our state elections and state primaries have unfolded, have made it impossible.
Okay, we should do Alien and Sedition Acts, and then I have my self-indulgent questions. So, um, what do people get right and what do people get wrong about the Alien and Sedition Acts?
So they get right that the Alien and Sedition Acts were a largely partisan measure with a couple of exceptions. So there were two Alien Acts, which people often don't know. There was an Alien Enemies Act, which is still on the books. It was put forward actually by the Republicans. It was a bipartisan measure, and it was seen as a very sensible defensive measure because it required the participation of all three branches. It required Congress to declare war. It required the president to issue a proclamation, and it required a judicial hearing before anyone could be deported. So this seemed like a very sensible thing to do in the event that you actually had war. There was a second Alien Friends Act, which basically gave the president unlimited authority to deport anyone at will. This was a arch federalist measure that was pushed through by the extreme members in Congress. John Adams did sign it, but he never used that authority to deport anyone, and that's an important piece. In terms of the Sedition Act, again, John Adams did sign it, but legislation at the time, like today, we expect the president to put forward a legislative agenda with his allies in Congress and to kind of push it through. Otherwise, it doesn't really happen. That is not how legislation functioned in the 1790s. Congress took its prerogative as the legislative branch very seriously, and they created the legislation. So while Adams did eventually sign the bill, he didn't help write it. He didn't, whip votes. He didn't count noses. He didn't do any of those things. Now, once it was passed, he wasn't totally disappointed to see the prosecutions of some of the more extreme editors who had been very mean to him. So again, yes, it is the black mark on his presidency, but the context of why this bill was actually passed is not a story that's usually told. Today, we have a much better sense of what the First Amendment actually means than they did in the 1790s because we've had centuries of jurisprudence that have carved out areas of restriction or exceptions. The most famous, of course, is, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. But the idea is that speech that is designed to provoke violence immediately is not protected. That had not been decided at the time, and newspaper editors were calling for violence, and people were responding right away. So there were mobs in the street beating up people. There were mobs that were threatening to tear down buildings. There were threats of arson. And so the fear behind what political speech could do was genuine and based in actual events that were happening. The problem is that was then perverted by the Federalist Party for partisan purposes. And so it's, for me, the important message is not that they were wrong to be afraid, or that we even have to think about what are limitations to speech that are appropriate under the First Amendment, but how do we prevent them being used for partisan purposes?
Okay, I want to hover over this point for just a second. The Sedition Acts, the censorship of newspapers was flagrantly unconstitutional and contrary to the First Amendment as we understand it today, right? That's part of your point. That was this body of precedents that built up over time. But a lot of the people who were at the Constitutional Convention in 1989 were alive and were watching all of this happen. Does this undermine the originalist or the original intent claims about the First Amendment if the people who were at the Constitutional Convention weren't setting their hairs on fire saying, wait a second, we wrote a First Amendment that says you can't do this, right? If they weren't doing that, then what does it say? What does it tell us about what they really thought the First Amendment meant?
Yeah. Well, so when Congress wrote the amendments in the summer of 1789, a lot of these partisan forces had not yet emerged. And so I think what it actually tells us is that it's a good reminder that the framers, as brilliant as they could be, were also very human and very prone to partisan ambitions and partisan tensions, and willing to kind of turn a blind eye or to think about how the ends justified the means. And this is not necessarily even a one-party thing, because while Jefferson decried the Sedition Acts during Adams' presidency, during his presidency, he was very happy for Sedition Acts to be implemented and enforced at the state level. He didn't want it at the federal level, but the state level, he was very happy to do it. I think that John Adams' presidency and George Washington's presidency are massive arguments against originalism, because their actions demonstrate that they didn't see the Constitution as this permanent and changing thing, but rather a blueprint or a plan for how to try and approach the challenges that were coming down the pike, but that they would have to have a certain level of flexibility because you couldn't predict the future. And there's so much that's unwritten in the Constitution that gives them space to try and figure out how to actually do things. So much of their presidencies fly in the face of sort of an originalist intent because they defy that. I mean, the creation of the cabinet is a rejection of originalist intent, because George Washington was at the Constitutional Convention when the delegates explicitly rejected a cabinet.
On what grounds? Just out of curiosity.
They were concerned that it would. So most Americans who were sort of pro-patriot in their loyalties believed that the British cabinet had been the cause of the revolution, because it was where all of the cronyism and corruption were centralized in the British government. And it was, it obscured any transparency or responsibility in government decision-making. And so they worried that if they created a cabinet, it would produce the same thing in the US government.
And so who was supposed to be doing the day-to-day work? I mean, like the Constitution mentions the Postmaster General, the Secretary of Navy, right? There are some of those cabinet-ish positions created.
Yeah. So it mentions, so it mentions department secretaries. They fully expected that there would be executive departments, but they did not want them meeting privately or secretly. And so they gave the power to the president to request written advice from the department secretaries on issues pertaining to their departments, but it was really supposed to be like they were managers of their departments and then exchanged written communication so that there was a written record of who said what and who advocated which position. And then the Senate was supposed to be a council of foreign affairs. The Senate was that advise and consent piece, they meant quite literally. And Washington fully expected to do that. He actually visited the Senate in August of 1789 to get advice on instructions he was giving to commissioners who were going to meet with Native nations in North Carolina and South Carolina. And it went so badly that he never went back again. And no president has ever gone back again for that capacity. And so that was an example of, they had this very well laid out plan, or what they thought was a well laid out plan, because these were going to be responsible, knowledgeable men that were selected by the state legislatures to be good and safe advisors. And if they were bad advisors, the state legislatures would remove them. And then Washington met with them and found the Senate to be very annoying and not sort of provide the prompt, immediate discussion and feedback he needed, and never went back. And so rejects this key part of the Constitution just a few months into his presidency.
Okay, so I don't want to derail us here, and I did tell you before we got started that rabbit holes and digressions were encouraged, but they shouldn't be coming from me. They should be coming from you. That said, I just want to put a pin in it for listeners. I think you can still make a case for. I take your meaning, and I think it's really interesting that these presidencies undermine the sort of hard originalist argument. Mm-hmm. I do not think that they throw away, they obviate or invalidate originalism per se, because in a Burkean or a Hayekian sense, you need something. There needs to be some pea underneath all those mattresses that is that for which these that holds these precedents together. A terrible metaphor, but you get the point. And I often argue when I'm in my Hayekian mode that there's a perfectly serviceable argument that green should mean stop and red should mean go. But there's an enormous reliance interest in the fact that everybody now understands that green means go and red means stop. And if you switched it arbitrarily, there'd be a lot of car accidents as people relearned their instincts on all these kinds of things. To have an originalist or a public meaning argument is simply to say that there is some foundational understanding of what the Constitution means from which we can pivot from time to time. But if you don't have that at all, right, if it's pure ad hocery functionalism kind of thing and Humpty Dumpty can mean whatever words he wants to mean, then you no longer, it's sort of, the originalist argument is in many ways, the soft originalist argument is kind of like a English Constitution with a founding text. And I think your point is very well taken, and I got some more questions about it, but I just want to put it out there that I'm willing to defend a softer version of originalism rather than say, well, Washington, it was supposed to be a cabinet, wasn't supposed to be a cabinet, blah, blah, all that kind of stuff. Therefore, we can just run wild with whatever interpretation we have for the Constitution. I don't think that makes that case.
No, I actually really agree with that. I think the concept of like a soft British version is actually quite sensible, because we have to have something we agree on. Right. I think where their model is perhaps instructive is they always saw the Constitution as the guide, but they saw the guide as intended to give them the best options available to govern sensibly. And that, I think, is a helpful way to think about it, is they didn't view it as so restrictive, but they also were not trying to completely scrap it and govern without any sort of model.
Right. We don't have to get into the weeds on departmentalism, but this is like, in the contemporary context, this is one of my great peeves. I'm one of these Congress should be ashamed of itself people. Because when you're elected to Congress, you take an oath to uphold the Constitution. But what we have interpreted that in the modern era as meaning basically you agree to abide by whatever the Supreme Court says the Constitution means. But there are all sorts of things that are not justiciable that the Supreme Court is not going to weigh in on. That doesn't mean that your oath to the Constitution doesn't mean anything. The Congress is supposed to care about its prerogatives, right? It's supposed to say, wait a second, you can't have a regime change war in Venezuela without talking to us first, right? And they are failing their constitutional oaths in my mind as pure as by refusing to play that role, as if they rejected the Supreme Court. And there's issue after issue where they have. This is where I think the founders were completely wrong. They never could have anticipated that Congress would not be a jealous guardian of its rights and prerogatives. They thought that ambition would keep it as a central player. In fact, the primary player in American politics, because it's the first branch, it's the Supreme branch. And they just could not have anticipated that it become a parliament of pundits that really just doesn't want to do its job. And anyway, so that's my point about, I think the constitutional order is about more than just following what the Supreme Court says the Constitution means. And I think Congress needs to be more in line with what the founders intended it to be for the sake of the health of our politics. But that's a digression. I apologize.
No, it's a really important one. And actually, one of the questions I get most frequently is, what would the founders think if they came back today? And people expect me to say something like, oh, they would be so horrified by the partisanship. And I often say, no, I mean, they would find that actually very relatable, because partisanship was terrible in the 1790s because they had very weak parties, and we have very weak parties today that don't protect moderation, they don't protect moderates, they don't protect compromise, they can't prevent the type of primaries that we're seeing, they can't weed out the crazies. These are things that a strong party does. What they would be surprised about is exactly that, is that Congress has completely, and this has been a multi-decade process that has accelerated recently, but a multi-decade process of completely subordinating itself to the executive branch and the Supreme Court in a way that they would have never anticipated, both because it was not their intention. They expected the legislative branch to represent the people, but also because it flew in the face of human history, which is that humans are usually jealous of their power and they don't usually want to give it up. And so even in the most intense moments of partisanship in the 1790s, Congress was still jealous of its power. And so they could not possibly have envisioned that that's where we would be today.
Okay. Well, you've scored heavily on Remnant bingo card here. But all right, so now some self-indulgent questions. I've read and heard that, let's put it this way. What has two thumbs and loves the Federalist Papers? This guy. But I've read and heard that in fact the Federalist Papers had almost no impact whatsoever. They came out too late. No one really read them. And so there are these great liner notes to the Constitution, but they weren't part of this wonderful argy-bargy of American democracy and persuasion kind of thing. They were kind of they've been kind of a historical afterthought and have been elevated since. Fair?
Well, I think that they did have an impact, especially on the later states' ratification. So the early states like Pennsylvania, which ratified quite quickly, they had no impact because they came out after that. But for the later states, I do think that they were important. And Washington's role in the ratification process is quite interesting, because when the Constitutional Convention submitted this draft constitution to Congress, he included a cover letter. All of the other delegates signed the Constitution. Only he signed this cover letter. And so it was basically an endorsement of this document. And we now separate those things. But at the time when they were printing copies of this Constitution, they included the cover letter in newspapers and in broadsides. And so it was very obvious that Washington was endorsing it. And at this point, he was already referred to as the father of the nation. And so that was a very powerful endorsement. Then he was silent, but that doesn't mean he was inactive. He was often taking snippets of speeches or things that were published and sending them to other editors to get them to reprint them and try and kind of gin up support. And one of the things that he did for that was to send copies of the Federalist Papers to other editors. And he actually initially, there's this great letter where he wrote to Hamilton saying, I've received this, not knowing that Hamilton wrote it, and I've sent it to this other editor. And then he learns later that Hamilton is the author, which I think is pretty funny. It's possible he may have recognized the writing, but at that point he didn't have confirmation. So I do think that it made a difference in terms of the ratification. And it is an incredibly useful primary source document to understand what were the issues they were debating at the time, what were the concerns that people had about the Constitution, how were they thinking about those arguments. So in terms of understanding what were the kind of different perspectives, it's incredibly useful. Where I sometimes push back is that it is not actually a legal document. It is not actually a decision by a judge, and it should never be seen as such. It's brilliant propaganda, but that is exactly what it is. It's designed to convince people. And so we have to separate it from an actual constitutional interpretation by a judge than what maybe people were arguing about at the time.
Okay, that's very helpful, actually, and good news. So one of the things I've become sort of obsessed with of late is, I'm a conservative. I don't make any apologies, but I'm kind of a homeless conservative for all the obvious reasons. So, but I am increasingly annoyed with over-reliance on the categories of right and left, and particularly in the sense that, and listeners have heard me talk about all this, so I won't name check the Lewis brothers and all these people, but that right and left do not really come into political discourse and analysis of the American scene, and basically until the 1920s and 1930s. It comes in from coverage of journalism about the Soviet Union, where they use right and left a lot because they were doing cosplay of the French Revolution. But it really isn't until early to mid 20th century that right and left become these codified things in American understanding. And yet there are a whole bunch of historians who, sort of popular historians who, on the right and the left, so I'm doing it, but like, who retroactively put various founders on right or left when they really didn't conceive of themselves in anything like those ways. I mean, that terminology barely existed in France at the time. It was about the seating chart in the National Assembly. It certainly hadn't crossed the Atlantic yet, right? Yeah. So what were the axes, right? What were the things that, like, were the immediate tells about what side you were on a fight? Like, like what was what were the team jerseys that maybe weren't right and left, but like explain what the worldview of the founders was and how they divided them?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. The right-left axis does not work for the founding generation at all, and I'll explain why. But there's a great new book out, The Pursuit of, I think The Pursuit of Happiness was first, and this is The Pursuit of Liberty. It's the second one in three by Jeffrey Rosen, who's the head of the National Constitution Center. And he looks at the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson sort of briefly in their own time, but then how it has survived in the last 250 years, and how the Hamiltonian ideas and the Jeffersonian ideas have basically been like roller coasters, as different parties have adopted different parts of it that suit them. And that is a great demonstration that they cannot map onto our political system today, because they can be used in so many different fashions and have been used in so many different fashions. So there were a couple of key issues that separated the two perspectives. One was foreign policy. Were you more inclined to ally yourself with France or with Great Britain? And the idea was, were you more motivated by the sort of ideological sister republic concept of Republican France? Or were you a little bit more pragmatic and said, Great Britain has the biggest navy in the world, they're our biggest trade partner, we share a language, we share a base for our legal system, this is the person that makes sense to be, this is the nation that makes sense to be closest to. So that was the first dividing piece. Just a step below that, it was, what do you think that the federal government should be doing? And the Republican Party, the Democratic Republican Party, wanted a very small federal government. They distrusted centralized power for a lot of different reasons, but a not insignificant one was they worried that if there was a strong central government, it could at some point be used to limit slavery. And that was already something they were discussing in the 1780s and 1790s. They wanted most powers reserved to the states. As part of that, they distrusted an army because it was going to be controlled by the federal government and could be used against the states, whereas Federalists generally preferred the federal government to have more authority. Not the authority we have today, but more authority. So the power to have a national bank, the power to invest in infrastructure, roads, canals, ports, harbors, the things that would facilitate trade and commerce between the states. Not something that states can really do in a one-off system. The power to create a national university, to bring people together to learn from one another and to educate a future generation. So the federal government was the next piece. And that's where that gets complicated, because if you think about today, in, let's say, maybe in the 1980s as a way to think about this cleanly, the Republican Party generally was considered the right party and considered the more conservative party and considered the smaller government party. You might think, oh, well, the Federalist Party is the more conservative party because maybe they were in some ways socially more conservative, but they were the big government party. They were the party that wanted investment and infrastructure and what we would think of as like jobs programs. So that is one example of it does not match up cleanly. And then there were a number of sort of cultural differences that were a little bit less clearly defined, but generally speaking, the officer corps from the Continental Army tended to be mostly Federalist because they were the first nationalists. Not nationalists like we think of today in a very pernicious fashion, but nationalists in that they traveled around the country. They were spending time with people from different states. They understood how important it was to have a union as opposed to just 13 states kind of doing their own thing. They tended to be more militaristic. They tended to have, and that meant that their visions of what masculinity should be tended to be more militaristic. Whereas, and this is not a perfect division because there were, like Charles Cotesworth Pinckney was a Federalist, but he was also a Southerner and a slave owner and had been a military veteran. So it doesn't map perfectly. But in general, the Democratic Republicans had less representation from the officer corps, from veterans. They tended to be less militaristic. They did tend to find their support in the South and in the West, whereas Federalists were sort of on the Eastern Seaboard and New England. Those are some of the divisions.
To lay the really self-indulgent question, to pick up on something you said about the nationalists. So there is this argument that, sort of like before when we were talking about the hard or soft originalism thing, there's a soft version of this argument that I am pretty sympathetic to in terms of an argument about cultural continuity. This was, for all intents and purposes, a British colony with a lot of British norms, British customs, a lot of our notions of rights and even, our constitutional structure to a certain extent are inheritances from the English tradition and yada, yada, yada. So I think there is something of a pre-constitutional American nation that is different than the country that comes in 1776 or 1789 or whatever. There's a hard version of this argument that I find usually pretty grotesque and racist, which is that this is a white nation from the beginning. It was a Christian nation from the beginning, that there was a real there was a homogeneity to the American experience for the first few generations, and that there's this incredible nostalgia for when we all got along as white people. And I'm sure you agree with me to some extent. I think this is all hot garbage, right? But
we have never agreed. We have never agreed. We are a very fractious and disagreeable people, and that is our inheritance.
Yeah. So, Charles Kessler is an old friend with whom I have many disagreements these days, but one of the things he said that I think is fair it's certainly in a poetic sense that the nation didn't create the Constitution created the nation. And I think as a way of thinking about these things, there's more truth. It's a useful way to think about it in terms of, or if you want to not say the Constitution, the founding created the nation, right? But how do you think about this? I'm sure you run into some of this stuff from time to time. How do you talk about it? How do you think about it in terms of explaining to people that like modern, particularly Rousseauian notions of nationalism are an alien retroactive imposition on what this country was 250 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I argue that the revolution is a pretty conservative one in that it does produce a nation that is, well, it is conservative in some ways, it is radical in others. It is conservative in that it produces a nation that largely borrows from the rule of law that came before it. So much of our legal system is a slight adaptation of common law. Most of the people that were in power remain in power. Most of our civic participation, the culture of civic participation remains largely the same, which is actually why it's successful, is because there was a culture of civic participation, unlike in France where there wasn't. And so you had this radical explosion. And so there are things about it that are very conservative, which is why it actually worked, because it was a fairly gradual evolution. And that continued, obviously, by the Jacksonian era. Suffrage was expanded to white men. The property requirements were largely removed. So it becomes a more permissive nation, but it is done slowly. What is radical about it is, of course, that it's a nation built on an idea. It's not built on an ethnic base. It's not built on our shared religion. And we know that because they did not see each other as having a shared ethnic base. They saw the American people as a very diverse people, even if we're only looking at the white men. So my favorite example of this is if you look at the picture of Washington's cabinet, which it's covered, I have it. But anyway, there's this picture of Washington's cabinet that was produced by, it was on a cigar box, and we see it and we see 5 dead white guys. They saw it and they saw people with different ethnic backgrounds, different religions, different educational traditions, different experiences. They saw a lot of diversity in that room. And that was by design. They were trying to bring together lots of different ways to be an American in one administration. In terms of what it means to actually build that identity, this is a question that I think really actually has to start in some ways with the Continental Army, because the war started in April of 1775. We didn't declare independence until the summer of 1776, which meant for basically from the time Congress created the Continental Army in July of 1775 and appointed Washington. And they created in June. He arrived in Cambridge in July of 1775. The Army then had a year to try and figure out, what does it mean to be an American? It's not enough to just say you're not British, which they were obviously trying to prove at gunpoint, but they had to try and articulate what it meant to be a thing. And that was incredibly difficult given the fact that the Massachusetts officers didn't particularly like those from South Carolina. And Washington initially referred to the Massachusetts soldiers as dirty and nasty. Now, to be fair, they didn't know how to build latrines and were poisoning themselves, so he had reason to think that. But he became incredibly respectful and really developed a reverence for their service, recognizing how much they were sacrificing to be there. But that process took time. And so one of the moments that I think is most important is on July 4th, 1775, he sent out general orders saying, Congress has created these united forces. It's important we set aside our divisions among region and instead come together to fight for this thing. And shortly thereafter, he adopts what's called the campaign, or the headquarters flag, which is the blue flag with 13 stars on it. And that was the flag that flew over his headquarters. And then when Congress adopted a flag, which didn't happen until the next year, they put that in the corner of what is now the United States flag. So that progress, that process of what it means to actually build an identity was very much sort of contested and mushy. And I think it still is. I mean, we still are arguing over what it means to be an American because we are not relying on the ethnic background or the religious background like other nations are, which is okay. We're doing a hard thing and it should be messy and hard, but it doesn't mean that we should deny that we're doing a hard thing.
So you kind of balked at the Constitution created the nation thing. You would sort of argue that the Continental Army created the nation, and then the Constitutional Convention kind of like put a bow on it.
Yeah, I mean, so I have always seen the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as part one and part two. The Declaration of Independence gives words to this idea that was very much in progress with the Continental Army. And then the Constitution is the part two of, okay, how do we actually make this work? But the nation, the Constitution was the second Constitution we had had. We had already had the Articles of Confederation. And the nation saw itself as very much in existence and, in fact, recognized the incredible opportunity of the Constitutional Convention because most nations don't get second chances. And they saw themselves as having a second chance to try and get it right. So I think to say that the Constitution created the nation kind of denies the lived experience of everyone, not to use, kind of a squishy 21st century term, but
good point.
It denies their experience up until that point. I think they would have said, excuse me, we've been trying to live as Americans for the last, 11 years.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Okay. There two last questions. One is I going back to my point about how I'm very, very angry with Congress for gelding itself, not to be too indelicate. And it seems to me that one of the great symptoms of that is that the impeachment power is almost a dead letter.
Yeah.
And if the impeachment power is a dead letter, I am not a let's amend the Constitution kind of guy, but I think we got to either get rid of or radically change the pardon power.
Yeah.
Because if the only recourse for Congress to correct bad pardons, truly corrupt pardons, is impeachment, and it won't impeach because of all the obvious reasons, then you have a situation where the president can literally suborn treasonous, criminal, corrupt behavior from people and just promise, don't worry about it, I'll pardon you afterwards. And I think we're seeing some of that already. We don't need to gild the lily, but what is one of the ideas I like to flirt with is, okay, let's go back and just say the president's pardon power can only apply to like the 3 or 4 crimes mentioned in the Constitution. So copyright infringement, you're in luck. Counterfeiting, piracy, and treason, right? That's basically it, more or less. There's some more implied ones. But I don't think that necessarily works. And it certainly wasn't the founders' intent that those were going to be the only federal crimes, because some of the first legislation they passed were about crime stuff, and they added a whole bunch of other crimes, including things like under the Alien and Sedition Act. So what did they think the pardon power was for and not for back then, particularly Adams and Washington?
Yeah, so they were really expecting the pardon. I mean, the pardon powder is funky because it comes from this sort of monarchical vestige in which the king had control over the entire judicial system. And so there was this idea that if the king could bring prosecutions, which the king could, then the king also needed to be able to grant mercy. And that mercy piece was, I think, what inspired them to retain this power, which is unusual for an executive in the Constitution, which is that if you have a human-designed system, so if we have a judicial branch that is designed by humans and operated by humans, humans are fallible, thus the justice system will sometimes be fallible too. And there needs to be space, probably fairly rare space, but space for mercy, for a recognition that maybe it's gone too far, or to give people who have largely lived an upstanding life a second chance. And that is how Washington and Adams viewed it. So Washington did give a number of pardons. This is something historians often get wrong, and so do pundits. His first pardons were not the Whiskey Rebellion. They actually came earlier in the presidency. He was often inclined to give them to veterans if they had mostly lived an upstanding life and had made a mistake. And so, for example, he gave a pardon in April of 1794 to a merchant who was basically convicted of rum smuggling because he brought in too much rum. There were limits on how much you could bring in, and his boat was seized, so his livelihood was destroyed. So Washington gave a pardon after people acknowledged wrongdoing and accepted responsibility and gave a loyalty oath to the Constitution. So that was particularly important for that pardon and for the Whiskey Rebellion pardons, that people had to accept what they had done was wrong. They had to take responsibility for those actions and uphold whatever law they violated. Then he would grant mercy. And Adams did the same thing. The pardons he gave to the Freeze Rebellion, it was both because they had acknowledged wrongdoing and taken responsibility, but also it was a recognition that the justice system was so partisan at that moment and was crushing these people for reasons that really didn't make sense and applying punishments that so far outweighed the crime that was a miscarriage of justice. And so he did give pardons at that point. They were not pardons to people they knew. They were not pardons to people they were in business with. They were not pardons to family members. In fact, both Washington and Adams were very reluctant to try and kind of keep that at bay. And that was the founders' expectation, that the president would, as the representative of all people, occasionally step in when mercy was appropriate. I agree that the pardon power as it currently works, and I think, this has been a process where there have obviously been problems over many administrations. I do think there's an acceleration now, but that it needs to be adjusted in some way, that it's clear there should be a recourse in that our justice system is imperfect and occasionally there needs to be something. But there's a reason most states entrust that power to a committee or to something like that rather than to one person. And so I think there absolutely needs to be something. And I think that you're right. The impeachment process is completely broken and there needs to be some sort of awareness of how do we have some sort of recourse.
Yeah, I mean, I'm for the ability for people to get pardons who deserve pardons. There are so many different ways you could do it. You can just give Congress some kind of veto over the pardon, right? But you would require as a constitutional amendment to do almost any of these things. All right. So last question. There's a rule in courtrooms that you're never supposed to ask a question you don't want to know the answer to. And it applies a little bit to podcasts as well. There is particularly among my more libertarian friends, there has been this sort of sort of the intellectual version of an urban myth that I'll just lay it out, right? So there's this theory that the founders picked Washington, D.C. as the capital because it was picking a pestilential swamp that no one wanted to live in was perfect for keeping government limited, right? So the main embassy every summer not the main embassy, the British embassy every summer would move to Maine for the entire month, for the entire summer, because it was just so equatorially unpleasant here.
Clearly they didn't really experience the Maine mosquitoes, but anyway, continue.
Yeah, fair. And then there's this argument that one of the reasons why we have, again, I'm just laying it out, the Leviathan state that we have today is because of the perfidious invention of air conditioning that made it tolerable to work in DC. So anyway, is there any actual, I'm so regret asking this, but is there any actual evidence that any of that kind of thinking factored into why they picked this spot for the nation's capital? Damn it. I knew it.
No.
We'll cut this part out.
There was a negotiation between the North and the South over where the capital would be. Southerners wanted it in the South, both because it was closer to home and easier to get to, but also because there would be less threat to the enslaved property that they brought with them to wherever the seat was. And the location was going to determine the culture of the government in a big way. There was a compromise between Madison and Hamilton, which is, of course, famously depicted in the Hamilton musical in the room where it happens, such that it would be on the Potomac River. roughly in between, but still considered in the South. And then the final location was given to Washington. And he had two factors in mind when he picked the actual location, which was it contained the only existing ports on the Potomac River that were important. So at the time, Alexandria was a very critical port and Georgetown was a critical port. And so they were going to make it easier to build a city if you actually had a place where you could, deposit things. And it was very close to Mount Vernon, which was beneficial to him for lots of reasons.
Sure. I mean, who wants a long commute?
Exactly.
All right. This was great. I hope you'll come back.
I would love to. I so enjoyed this conversation.
I can do more of this all day long. Again, and we're very good at moving books here. So I
appreciate it very much.
I highly recommend. The book again is Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. Lindsay Chervinsky, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me.